thank you very much for agreeing to this. Let me present yourself. You're the executive director of Boulder County, an association that advocates for the rights of LGBTQ plus people in Boulder County, Colorado. Is that correct?
That is correct. My name is Marty, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers, and that you got it right.
So, what actually does Boulder County in your community? So, what are your main activities and purpose?
Well, you know, I can't talk about today and where we're going without talking about where we've been and how we started. And so in the state of Colorado in 1992, there was something called Amendment 2 that our friends and neighbors and family voted on. And it was removing or ensuring that LGBT people, gays and lesbians, I think was the legislation, would not have any rights, any protections around public accommodations, etc. And that case went to the United States Supreme Court in a case called Romer versus Evans. So if you look at the history of not all LGBT groups, but those that are surviving, most of them formed between 1992 and 1994. Colorado was known as the hate state, and people were canceling their convention trips here. And but Gene Dabowski, who lives in Boulder and is a supporter of Boulder County, took that case pro bono all the way to the Supreme Court, and we won, and that law was never enacted. But out of that, Boulder sprang from a group of activists in Boulder County that started the first Pride Parade in the city of Boulder. And they like to talk about being the smallest Pride Parade. It went about a block. And in my office today still hangs the baton that somebody carried in that parade. So we hang on to our past as we look towards the future. Boulder County today, we talk about education. So one of our staff members goes to corporations. They've trained all the district attorneys throughout the state of Colorado on LGBTQ issues. Most recently, they're working with the Boulder Shelter. There are a lot of transgender folks who are homeless in our community. And so working to change systems that aren't set up to deal with our identities. So we do a variety of training and a variety of education, even in the schools through a speakers bureau, which is Boulder County's longest running program called Speaking Out, where a trained group of people go in and tell their stories of coming out. And they speak mostly to allies because frankly, the world is made up of more straight people and cisgendered people than it is the rest of us. So it's an amazing program that reaches thousands of kids each year. We also provide services and programs. One of the things that we knew prior to the pandemic was that LGBTQ people suffered from higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicidality. And we knew that because of our own studies, groups like the Williams Institute or Movement Advancement Project, because of course the government's not going to tell you any of that because they don't keep track of LGBTQ identities in national data. There are a few exceptions, but they're pretty sparse in what they collect. And so in March of one of these years during the pandemic, two trans people who were connected on the periphery to the organization died by suicide. And we know suicide is a lagging indicator of poor mental health. And in that moment, I called one of our local county commissioners and I said, you all have to give us some money now because people are dying and we need to set up a program because the systems that are put together are not serving us. And we know that from individuals going to local mental health services and saying, wow, that was not a good match. For example, a gay Mexican man, now a Mexican-American man, was working towards his citizenship during the time of Donald Trump. He was stressing out, as you can well imagine. He goes to a therapist and he tells this story of fear and anxiety. And the therapist said, there's not that much to worry about. Now, that kind of response, not understanding the intersections of gay identity, immigrant identity, along with mental health, keeps people sick and leads to really poor outcomes. So out of that, we've started brand new. It started in November, and it's really starting to get all of its wheels on the road is a program called The Point. And we do case management. And the point is to get people into systems. So we are working with an LGBTQ therapy group. People come to out Boulder County, and we do some assessment, get them connected to services, and then case manage. That program's taking off. And again, we have to build our own systems because the larger systems don't provide for us. That's one of our newest programs. We have a strong youth program. So I don't even know the numbers anymore of how many youth we're serving. We run 3 social support groups. Last night, they celebrated the Lunar New Year. It was youth-led programming with one of the local high schools in their Asia club. We do a youth camping trip in the summertime. That is transformative. So there's a lot of programs going out of there. We also run transgender programs, and we're looking at right now, we're serving a certain segment of the transgender community well, but there are segments that we're not. So there's an advisory committee that's looking at what we need to add, what we need to change about what we're currently doing. So I can go on and on. We do a million things. We also throw the best gay party in all of Boulder, our gala. Last year we had Margaret Cho, who's a comedian and in the community and hilarious. So we do all of those things, but we do a lot of advocacy. And so I've been the executive director for about 8 years, just over 8 years. And one of the things a couple of things that have been terrible since I've been executive director was, one, the massacre in Orlando. After that tragedy, that day we held a vigil, and we brought together faith leaders and community members and had a vigil. And in that, we didn't have, in the States, you have to have a permit for everything. If you want to gather on the corner, get a permit and follow all these rules. And so we didn't have time to follow all the rules. And in that, a gay police officer showed up on his own time and blocked the streets for us, and got to talking with him and started building a little bit of a relationship with him. Really swell guy, good human being, happens to carry a gun, also is gay. And through that, he and I started talking, and I'm glad we did. And we started doing some training of local law enforcement, and that has grown. We had some grant funding initially. And so Mikkel, who's our trainer, started working with the detective there, and we started putting trainings together of, like, when you pull somebody over. In Colorado, there's an X marker, and there's a handful of states who have an X marker. So when you get your driver's license, you can check male, female, or X. And so we know for all kinds of reasons that the LGBTQ community as a whole has some suspicions that are well-founded. After all, Stonewall was a riot, about the police. And so as we're trying to build safety for our community, trainings on, like, if you pull somebody over and they have an X marker, federal systems don't take an X marker, right? So the cop is sitting there, pulled you over, and they have to walk away checking a box of male or female. Like, how do you do that? How do you have a conversation? How do you communicate that I see you, I know who you are, and yet this system doesn't fit? So trainings on a variety of things, also reporting. So one of the things that happened during the reign of Donald Trump, a former president of the United States, is that hate crimes and hate incidents in Boulder County spiked. He was inaugurated in January. Even before the inauguration, we started getting reports. And the whole time I had been here prior to that, I'd had a couple of people reach out to us around hate incidents or hate crimes, looking for assistance with the police. Well, all of a sudden we had like 18, it was either 18 or 22 within a year's period. And, some of them were incidents. Some of them were people were beaten, called racial slurs, homophobic slurs, and ended up in hospitals. And in that, I've started doing more advocacy and training with police departments. We had an incident not long ago at a municipality within our county where a genderqueer person who appears to many people as male, reported a sexual assault. And the police officer's response was, "Why didn't you just push him away?" That's not right. So we know the level of work that we have to do and the level of training for the LGBTQ community to have any safety in reporting incidents such as sexual assault or hate crimes. So I try to run as a buffer in getting things reported and make sure crimes are investigated well. So we do a lot of that work. But one of the things that so I worked for the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which is now called the National LGBTQ Task Force. It's the oldest national LGBT advocacy group in the United States. And they're an amazing organization. I had the opportunity to work for and watch people who specialize in policy advocate for years while I was there, but decades before and still after, on getting LGBTQ people included into the census data, right? So they don't, if you're checking a box, the choices are male, female. They don't ask about sexual orientation. And so we're not seen in any of the data. So they've been advocating for it. Well, so here comes COVID. And we ended up with the first study in the nation of LGBTQ people and hesitancy to the vaccines. Now, we did some quick surveys ahead of time because we know that we're economically disadvantaged, that more of us live in poverty than don't. A lot of us are in service industry jobs. Just like go down the list and look at the social determinants of health, and like the LGBTQ community is not going to fare well in this. And that's what the numbers proved. So we started doing direct aid grants. We secured funding from government sources, from private sources, and started a new program for us, which is continuing now because we just had a terrible wildfire in our county, the Marshall wildfires, where 1,000 homes were destroyed. And so we now have a direct aid fund. I think the first grants will be going out on Monday for members of our community who lost everything, including pets, their families. We only had 2 deaths in that. But back to my COVID story. So in 2013 in Boulder County, there was a historic flood. I was in New York. I got hired the week of the flood and hadn't gotten back to my home state of Colorado yet. But it was a terrible flood, lives lost, local, national news was here with helicopters. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And one of the things that 2 women noticed, Carmen Ramirez, who is, excuse my language, but a badass in our county, and Marta Lochamin, who is currently a county commissioner, they did a study called Resiliency for All. And in that, it was found that the people who didn't recover well from the flood or suffered the most were communities of color. And there are, I could be wrong, but I don't think there was a mention of LGBTQ communities in that. But because of that, and because of that study, our government systems started putting in place what they call cultural brokers. And it's a word that means somebody of the community, for the community, who can lead the community. And in that, they started making some changes to how the government takes feedback in, who gets invited to the table. And so when the pandemic struck, Boulder County pulled together a group of people, LGBT people, brown people, Black people, disabled people, fill in the list, to be at the table. And every month they talked about a different issue, whether that be childcare, mental health, down through the list, financial impacts. When the word of the vaccines came, which none of us believed that it would happen in December, but it did happen in December. And in that conversation, Kaylin Gray, who is a psychological researcher, was at the table, a member of our community, an out lesbian. And she said to the director of health equity in Boulder County, would it be helpful if we had information about the LGBTQ community and hesitancy to vaccines? And the response was that would be a gift. So we hopped on it. We ended up with research that showed that people assigned female at birth were most hesitant in the vaccines. And that makes sense for all kinds of reasons, right? As a woman who's going to be 60 this year, I remember that women were never even included in clinical trials, right? I mean, that's, kind of like, right, why would you trust any of this, right? Do they even include us? Well, then you start thinking more, and it's like, did they do any tests with HIV positive men who were on PrEP? Or did you pull transgender people in who are on larger amounts of hormones? Is there anything going on there? What about pregnancy? What about like all these things? And there wasn't any information coming out from our federal government about any of those populations. Why? Because we weren't included in any of the stuff they did in their clinical trials. And so we got invited to a table that still meets, the Vaccine Equity Coordinating Committee. And we started addressing all the barriers that our local public health system has in place, not because they think about it, but because it is, and they don't think about it. So language, like all the materials were in English. Nobody had even thought about showing up to a vaccine clinic with someone who speaks Spanish, with materials written in Spanish. We worked with that and built a fantastic relationship with a local Latino group called El Centro Amistad. Yep. And Jorge and I, like, we were on it. We did vaccine work day and night for months. Then we added Craig from the Center for People with Disabilities. Like all these things, they call them mobile clinics in the United States. You have to have a car. This is not the correct name. If you don't have transportation, if you can't take time off work, if you don't speak English, if you're unsighted, if you're in a wheelchair, if you speak Nepali, like go on and on. And that was kind of blew my mind, because I always thought as public health as being in the United States as a system that takes care of everybody. Well, that's not true. And there's a lot of work going on. In fact, I spoke at a CDC Foundation panel last week, and their great minds are now thinking about modernizing the data and like reimagining public health. And I think it took the pandemic to do that. So as I was working alone in my basement, like we all were during the pandemic, with the TV on in the background, and I would hear somebody from the federal government say, we're going to have an equitable distribution. And then they would start talking about Black communities and brown communities. And I would listen and think, well, and the other pieces of equity, and they never came forward with any of them. And racial equity is important. And you're not going to get me to say anything different, because I believe it's very important. And I also believe when you have the intersections of other identities, and when you are an LGBTQ person, even white, there are barriers, and there are questions that need to be asked and answered for you to feel safe in any situation. So we started advocating for that, and we had to do our own studies. And so now we have, like this 2 weeks ago, somebody from the county reached out to us and said, what's the food insecurity like in the LGBT community? I actually should be asking them, right? And so, here we are, this little team of 12 people, like pulling all the data together without funding for systems, so then we can figure out how to break down the barriers to get our people to food. This is a broken system. So we are in the process of running, we're getting ready to, what do they call it? Introduce a bill in the state of Colorado that would require the Colorado Department of Public Health, which is the state public health agency, to include in their data sets and to ask the questions around true gender identity. One of the fastest growing segments of the LGBTQ community is the non-binary population. I don't know what it's like in Italy, but that's here. And so we haven't figured out what language, and we're looking for some national guidance, which I think will be coming soon. It's nowhere codified that the government collect racial or ethnic identities. We're going to codify that. And there's nowhere where disability is collected. So we're going to get that codified. So one of the things I think Boulder addresses the problems where they are and works to change the system so that problem disappears. And I have gone on, but I love this work and I think it's important work.
No, I can see that you love it. About collection of data, recently you published what may be the nation's first LGBTQ plus and BIPOC led survey on vaccination intake. So what were the results of that survey?
I think the one you're referring to is our youth survey or young adults.
Youth survey, yeah.
Yep. So in that, and it's not comparing apples to oranges, right? Because our first study was on adults and we saw so much hesitancy. In this youth survey, which was probably 6-7 months later, as a whole, trans kids, youth, gay and lesbian kids, bisexual kids, and kids of color are less hesitant and more vaccinated. What we found in our survey is that white, poor, cisgendered youth are the ones with the most hesitancy and least likely to be vaccinated. So what I'll do in my mind, and again, it's apples and oranges, but I feel like our education work around the vaccines has been successful because we've seen this increase in vaccinations. We held the vaccine clinic yesterday. The big bus from the state came in and I think we vaccinated 48 people yesterday. And we're going to continue. I think we have 3 more clinics through spring, 4 more clinics through spring that we will continue to vaccinate people. But that was the finding. So there's a connection between there's a connection between race. And usually when you think about like, oh, there's a connection between race and hesitancy, the racist mind jumps to it's people of color. And talk about queering things up. When we say race is a barrier to vaccinations, it's white people. And that is because, in my opinion, the last administration under Donald Trump politicized public health, and they continue to do it. So when we have media sources like Fox Media and that terrible human being, Tucker Carlson, like spewing all these lies, or Joe Rogan on Spotify. I don't know if you saw that. No. Neil Young pulled his music, and now Joni Mitchell today, one of my all-time faves, 2 of my all-time faves. But when that information is out there, and then you look at why they're hesitant or resistant, even like, no, I'm not going to take it. It's because they get their information from their parents or they get their information from social media. So those 2 things, in my opinion, are going to continue to, we're going to have more variants. You know, we're still stuck. There's a certain level now that are never going to get vaccinated. Someone I know died this week of COVID, somebody from my hometown, and I know what their political leanings were. They weren't vaccinated and left behind 4 kids and a wife. Good guy. Got caught in the trap of this misinformation and this politicization of a vaccine that's effective and saves your life. So it's heartbreaking where we are in the United States, and I don't think we're unique.
No,
with these so yeah.
I'm so sorry. We hear these stories here too about this ideological mistrust towards vaccination and spurred by political propaganda. Talking about mistrust, historically there has been some kind of I don't know how to call it, bad relationship between the community and the medical institutions in the United States. Something, of course, related to the history of the community in America, especially if we talk about pandemics and go back to HIV. So do you see the same pattern, or do you see something as a like something born of that mistrust that you see in the data?
There is certainly mistrust, and you're right that with AIDS and Ronald Reagan and I'm like, which is when I came to, it was in 1982 when I came out, and that was the beginning. They didn't even call it AIDS then, right?
No.
ARC, I think, is what it was first called, maybe. There
And
is that
GRID, I think.
GRID, right?
Yeah.
You're right. There is still that mistrust. So when you go to, like, let's speak for myself. When I go to the doctor, it's like for a pap smear or something like that, to take care of my whole body, I still have these old tapes that run in my head, right? They're going to find out I'm a lesbian. They're going to be weird about it. It's going to be like, that seems simple, but like that breeds more mistrust. And that's just, that's me. And I have money to go to the doctor. I have a healthcare plan, but those simple kind of things. Because when you live in a world that doesn't accept you, it, as a rule, it invades every part of you. And it's not, when we talk about mental health numbers, it's important to, like, there's nothing inherently wrong with us. But after, you get misgendered a million times, or somebody yells at you or sends you a fax, they still send faxes here, the Fred Phelps of the world people, telling you you're going to burn in hell. Like, I know that's not true, but after a lifetime of churches telling you that, government systems not seeing you, of course it's going to bleed into the medical industry. And there have been some changes made, certainly not enough, but I think we're moving in the right direction with healthcare, in that many of the health records, the big companies like Allscript or Epic, they now are providing a way for healthcare systems to collect, and it's optional. I should say all of this, the advocacy, the bill that we're going to run, it's optional. You don't have to check it off. If you don't want to check off lesbian in that, you don't have to. It's not like a forced field, but the more information we have, the better we're going to understand the health community. But when you're not seen, so now these systems allow somebody to enter that data on you. Transgender man, straight, like that information will be there. And then that information will then go on to other systems where we can start looking at percentages and isolate issues. But here's the problem with that. You can build a system, but if nobody knows how to run it or to ask a question, right? So, I think I went in, I had a COVID scare over the summer. So I went to an urgent care facility. Woman was really nice. Here I am. I'm a 6-year-old gray-haired, straight-looking enough person, and I go in, and she's very nice, and she checks me in, and I wait. Had great treatment. Left. She handed me my receipt, and the questions were there to ask. Right? She could have like gone through checking my name, gay, straight, whatever, and she didn't. Right? And there's a study right now that that somebody behind the desk asking you those questions, I mean, it's common sense. You're less likely to say, yeah, lesbian, not transgender person. But if you have one of those kiosks, so if you walk up to one of those things to check in, or if you're sitting at a desk and they turn it around, kind of like the Visa card that you slide in, kind of, they turn that around and you could enter it without having to have a conversation, you'll probably collect the data. Now that costs money, right? Training costs money, that kind of technology, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
So yeah, you speak a lot about collecting data as a key to the visibility of the community in the US. But what's the attitude of members of the community towards the government taking collecting data on their sexual orientation, gender identity?
Oh, there'll be pushback, I assure you. You've nailed on there, and that's why I say optional. Everything about this is optional. Um, I think there's probably even more fear coming out of the Trump administration when I wouldn't want him to have information on me. And I think there's something similar that when marijuana became legalized and you could get marijuana, you had to sign up. I think it was for medical marijuana or something, but you could get a card and like people didn't want to put their name on that list, like for good reasons, right?
Yeah.
And so it's optional, and now it's been normalized, and there's no list. You can just go in and buy marijuana. And I think it'll become normalized after a while, but there'll be people who'll be so mad at me for even suggesting this. But I can tell you it's important because I am so surprised, and I asked one of the vice presidents of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who was in public health when GRID started and through that process. And I'm like, can you tell me why the federal government didn't begin collecting sexual orientation then? No. I think probably because Reagan was in charge and we still didn't exist or whatever that was like. But there are health reasons to have this information. The other thing is that little nonprofits like out Boulder County, or even big ones, if you don't have data, the funders won't give you any money. Right. And so you can't address issues without data. They want data, and then they want you to evaluate the data and to show improvements or not. So it'll lead to the strengthening of LGBT small groups like Al Boulder throughout the country, if they could actually have that data, because not everybody has a research team. Like we're slowly building our own little research team because we have to. There's a statewide organization, great organization called One Colorado, but they haven't done a statewide health equity assessment of our community, I think, since 2018. So, we need to do some different pieces of that. And so that's one piece of the work, but I think that data will affect systems in such a way that it will strengthen programs that serve our community.
Yeah, I think you nailed what's the actually one of the most important things in relationship with the government here in Italy too. Collecting data, make the community visible in programs trying to help people. Yeah, so I can totally relate to it, and I actually can relate also to the fear many people feel
Yes.
giving information about their identity to the government, and maybe now trying to help them, but in the future maybe try to hurt them based on
That's
that.
exactly right. That's exactly right. And so there has to be a lot of data security built into the programs. For the census, for example, they say this information will never be shared. Yes, it will. There's at some point, it's decades later, but that information becomes public, right? And so we want to be clear. There's a piece around security that's built into like how this data is going to be handled. And there's bad actors everywhere, but we have the Colorado Division of Civil Rights, and that would be a mechanism. So if a doctor, you give them that information and all of a sudden you're discriminated against, there's a government system that would come in and deal with that situation. So you have to have safeguards throughout. And I'm one of those too. Like I'll check it off because it's important, but will I do it and think, oh, there might not be any ramifications? No, I'm not an idiot. Like I've been around the block long enough to know that, systems are what systems are. But if we aren't seen in the data, the system's never going to change.
No, definitely no. So moving on from that, usually moving on to more general topic. Colorado, when we think about it politically, it's like an island in the Mountain West. It's famous for being one of the most LGBT friendly state. in the Mountain West. Is it because it's democratic leaning, or there are many reasons?
I think there are many reasons. You've done your homework. I wish I could say that I knew much of anything about where you're sitting today and what that's like. Um, I think that Colorado, so I was born in Colorado, lived here the majority of my life, but have been in New York City and Houston and Seattle for 20 years. So I've lived other places. Colorado, it's like pioneers, right? With like, my family was coal miners and ranchers is how they ended up here. And this there's a big libertarian, so they call them independents, like in the polls or whatever, but they're libertarians. They're like, leave me alone. I want my gun. I want my dog, my little woman at home. Government, stay out of my business. Don't vaccinate me, right? And then there's this group. We had Pat Schroeder. So Pat Schroeder was one of the first women in Congress. Back in the 70s. She's amazing. She's still alive. And so we had some people like that who showed up kind of early on, and at least in my lifetime, that made Colorado think differently, I think. Like, wow, women aren't at the table? Wow. But Pat Schroeder was. And so I think Colorado has that. We also, the ski industry is big. So it brings people from all over who probably stay and bring other, East Coast or West Coast ideas along with them. There's something in my own community. So I live in Longmont, which is a city in Boulder County. And Boulder is a city in Boulder County. And in Longmont, which was where my family, my grandparents lived, they say, don't boulderize Longmont. Like, don't bring your wild ideas over here, like wild ideas, like treat people with kindness, kind of stuff. And it's cowboy mentality. So it's this cowboy mentality that clashes with more liberal, like I'm a liberal, right? I think I would, a moderate liberal. I used to be a radical, kind of radicalized, little bow tie and like burn the thing down. And then I got old and realized change is incremental. So I just think that we're unique in thought. Denver being one of the larger cities in this area, I think has had an impact throughout. We have the ski resorts, which is an industry that draws others. The tech companies have come here like crazy. So like Apple just bought up a bunch of property in Boulder and is bringing 700 employees sometime soon. We have Seagate, the big technology company here in Longmont. So there's a lot of tech also. And I would harken back to in 1992 when our neighbor said, you're not going to get any rights. That galvanized the community and has made us stronger. And like, no, we've seen it happen before and it's not going to happen again. But people come, like when we do the Pride celebration in Boulder, people come from New Mexico, from Wyoming, they come down from South Dakota. And so it's a bit of a hub, and it's not all great here. We're also the healthiest city. And it's like, who are they surveying? Right? Because the people who are walking into our office looking for help, they wouldn't check off the box that, they're the healthiest. So it's interesting. And I will say that when I moved here back home in 2013, Boulder County, so the Human Rights Campaign does these rating system of municipalities, the Municipal Equality Index. And the city of Boulder, they just pick who they're going to survey. And so they picked Boulder, and Boulder was scoring really poorly. Like I want to say it was in the low 80s. And so I'd only been on the job a couple of weeks, and I got a call from Carmen Ottolano, and she said, we need to meet with you. The city manager says this has to increase. And so we started working with the city to make some changes, to help them make changes, and they've made them. So this year we scored 100. We should have gotten higher score, but we're learning how to fill out their form. But everything from having a LGBT liaison in the city manager's office, to having LGBT liaisons in the police department. There's a lot of things they score on. And it's been less than a decade, but we've made a lot of improvements. Do you think I got to the answer to your question? Like, what's
Yeah,
unique about it?
yeah, definitely. Thank you. So you talk about your upbringing in rural Colorado and your radical past. So what was your experience, your political experience, and your experience with activism?
Well, I came out during AIDS.
How was that?
It was scary, and then it became sad, and then it wiped out. Like, I have very few male friends of my age, and the ones that I have are mostly people who came out after AIDS. You know, they were in a marriage or something like that, or and so like Urvashi Vaught standing up in a press conference with that sign, you know, the activism that changed the way the federal government worked. I think that radicalized me. I'm like, that's how you have to make systems change, is you can't be nice and work for this incremental stuff all the time. Sometimes you have to be that person that says something that nobody likes, but that moves an entire group of people forward. And so watching, and she's getting an award this year from the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, the Creating Change Conference. And it's going to be virtual because of the surge and the new variant. But people like that, I have a big picture that hangs in my house of Harvey Milk, you know, and being this little kid in a town of 3,000 people. My dad was a veterinarian, so it was a rural area. You know, I'm pulling calves and, you know, vaccinating cows and all that stuff as a kid. And we went to a Methodist church. So, and I didn't hear anything other than bad things about homosexuals. And there was one person who was gender nonconforming who brought she went by her dog into the office, and I was like, what's up with that? Like, you know, I was always the tomboy. My brother would be inside reading, and I'd be on the motorcycles, and I never fit what my mom's still disappointed in me. Let's be clear. You know, I'm not going to wear that dress. I'm not going to carry that purse. And so I never fit. And then I also like had these thoughts, and I'm like, oh my God, you are a pervert, because that was the language I had. And so I never really had any language around it. And then I went out to the University of Denver. I met 2 lesbians, and I'm like, oh my God, you know, like light bulb, like I'm not a freak. There are people like me. And I'm like, wow. You know, which is when I think I came out when I was 18 or 19, something like that. Not to my family, because God forbid, that's why I moved to Houston. Like, I can't tell these people, and I need to go on with my life. And that took a while. But, you know, I think of Harvey Milk, come out wherever you are. I think of when I was in New York City. So Edie Windsor is also one of my personal heroes. And the day that Edie Windsor took down the United States of America will be one of the biggest days of my life. One person who, with the help of some great women lawyers and PR firms, won. And so I was working at the center, the LGBT center in New York City. And Edie Windsor like had been married at the center to her first wife, Thea, had been one of the early founders. And I said to one of my teammates, I'm like, we should have Edie's press conference here. And they're like, oh, that's a great idea. Let's do that. So that morning, and we set it up the big TV, and in New York, everybody gets around late, right? And so the Supreme Court ruling came out early, but we had this big screen, and I had reached out to a few friends. I'm like, we're going to have this going, come to the center early. So we were at the center early, and it's me and Kate and a couple of other friends, and Glenda, the executive director, who's still there. She's fantastic. And my friend Sarah, who ran the youth program. And we were standing there, and the TV comes on, and like Edie Windsor like won. And there was a AP photographer there that day. And so when you Google the gay that day, like our pictures, the four of us and like jumping up and with joy. And then Edie came and I was standing at the center and I was looking out the window and these big black, fancy cars pull up. And as the doors open, only women got out of the car. You're used to seeing like these cars pull up and all these men pile out and here comes Edie. And they went in and did the press conference. And after the press conference, there was thousands of people there then. And Edie said, I'll greet people, but I'm not going to make a speech. And so we needed to get her from the first floor to the third floor. And Glinda said to me, what are we going to do? And I'm like, you take that door and I'll take this door. So we were the bodyguards for her that day, which is one of the highlights of my actual life, is being a bodyguard. And I was so tough that day and like, do not touch Edie Windsor. But like when one person like that can make such a tremendous difference, that's what I've always held up is like one person can make a big difference and it's not easy. And, Edie was suffering from some great health issues, the stress of that. But to make it through that and to come out the other side and Harvey Milk to be murdered over it. And, not to be weird or maudlin, but when I was in a grand marshal for the Pride Parade in Denver, and it was during the height of the Trump administration, and hate was, it's still on the rise, frankly, but the numbers were going up, and the threats were going up, and I was scared, like I was really scared, and so there's one of the famous Harvey Milk quotes that I still have in my wallet, which is, if a bullet should enter my brain, let it break down every closet door. And that's kind of how I've lived. You just have to keep doing what you think's the right thing, ask God for help, find people who are like-minded and keep moving. And, and I have learned, and also out of coming out during the AIDS pandemic, I saw how one neighbor helped another neighbor and turned into great AIDS service organizations like Chicken Soup Brigade in Seattle, Washington. It's just taking chicken soup to somebody. And because nobody would touch it. And I've been, I still have the terrible vision of my head and visiting my friend JJ and Jefferson Memorial Hospital in Houston, who was dying of AIDS. And they wouldn't even like remove the trash from his room. Like nobody would even go in his room. So I think that radicalized me. And then you learn that you get more flies with honey. And so I try to use that wherever I can, but I'm not opposed to using the other methods also.
Yeah, thank you for that.